The humid sea air of Newport, Rhode Island, was filled with the scent of salt and a faint freshness of the forest. Sarah Lawson stood at the wrought iron gates of an old mansion that loomed ahead, surrounded by dense trees and meticulously trimmed bushes. She had just secured her first job after a long period of unemployment, as a waitress at private parties hosted in the Bennett family estate. The mansion was massive, built of gray stone with tall windows that seemed to see through time. It was an impressive architectural masterpiece, a reminder of wealth and privilege from bygone eras. Sarah stepped inside cautiously. She was greeted by a stern man in a black suit. "Welcome, Miss Lawson," he said with a slight bow. "My name is Mr. Harper. I am the house manager. Allow me to show you your uniform and duties." Sarah nodded, feeling a flutter of nervousness. She was instructed on how to serve drinks, keep the tables clean, and remain in the background so as not to disturb the guests. It was her first day, and she was determined not to embarrass herself. Later that evening, during a grand reception, she carried a tray of champagne glasses, struggling to maintain her balance on heels that were slightly too big for her. In the center of the hall, musicians played, guests chatted animatedly, and light from a grand chandelier scattered like a rainbow across the polished floor. As Sarah navigated along the walls, she noticed a large panel of family photographs. Her gaze stopped on a black-and-white photo of an 8-year-old girl. Sarah froze. The girl looked like a replica of herself as a child. "This is impossible," she thought, feeling a chill run down her spine. She set the tray down and stepped closer. The image, though old, was clear enough for her to recognize her own face, her eyes, her nose. "Are you all right?" A deep voice behind her made her jump. Sarah turned to see a middle-aged man with a noble bearing. His black hair, streaked with gray and sharp features, made him instantly memorable. He was watching her intently, concern in his eyes. "I'm fine," she stammered, stepping back. "I'm sorry, I thought, this photo." Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to continue. "The girl in the photo. She looks just like me when I was little." The man stepped closer, looking at the photo. His expression changed. "That's strange," he muttered. "This photo was taken many years ago. The girl in it is my childhood acquaintance Helen's daughter. But if you're saying you see a resemblance—" "I do," Sarah said confidently. "I have no connection to your family. At least, none that I know of." The man frowned, glancing around the grand hall as if searching for answers in its shadows. "Let me introduce myself," he said finally. "I'm Richard Bennett. It seems we need to have a conversation." Richard Bennett led Sarah into a small sitting room with a massive fireplace. The walls were adorned with portraits, clearly crafted by some of the finest artists of their time. He gestured for her to sit in an armchair opposite him, while he settled on a leather sofa, observing her with barely concealed curiosity. "Tell me about yourself," he requested, clasping his hands together. "Who are your parents? Where did you grow up?" Sarah fidgeted uneasily. "I grew up in Providence, in an ordinary family. My mother, Julia Lawson, was a teacher. My father, he left when I was only 2. My mother never talked about him." She hesitated, feeling memories of her difficult childhood rising to the surface. Richard leaned forward, his gaze growing sharper. "Julia Lawson, you said?" he repeated, as though trying to recall something. Then he turned away, looking into the fire. "Helen." Sarah frowned. "Sorry, who is Helen?" Richard sighed heavily before answering. "Helen was a girl I once loved. It was many years ago when my parents still owned this house. She worked here as a maid. We were young, reckless, and believed our love could overcome anything." His voice faltered, as though he didn't want to continue. After a pause, he went on. "Of course, my family thought differently. My father, a very strict and controlling man, did everything in his power to destroy our relationship. He forced her to leave, severing all contact." Sarah listened, a growing unease taking root in her chest. "And you think I might be her daughter?" she asked, struggling to believe her own words. Richard shrugged, though a glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. "The girl in that photograph you saw, that's Helen as a child. The resemblance between you two is too strong to be a coincidence." He met her gaze. "Sarah, it's possible that I am your father." Her heart stopped. This was too strange to be true, yet the pieces were starting to fit. Why had her mother never spoken about her past? Why had she always avoided questions about Sarah's father? "That's impossible," Sarah muttered, trying to process what she had just heard. Richard remained silent, as though unwilling to pressure her. Then he said, "If you're willing, I'd like to investigate this further. Perhaps you have some documents, photos of your mother, anything that might shed light on her past." Sarah thought for a moment. At home, she had a box of her mother's papers that she hadn't opened in years. Perhaps the answers were in there. "I have some of my mother's belongings," she said. "I'll look through them." "But, if this is true, what then?" Richard stood slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "If it's true, then I want to do what I should have done years ago, take care of you. But first, we must find the truth." Sarah nodded, feeling her world shifting rapidly beneath her feet. She had never sought her father, but now, perhaps, he had found her. Sarah returned home late at night, her thoughts a whirlwind of chaos. She opened a dusty cabinet and pulled out a box hidden in its depths, a heavy wooden chest filled with her mother's photographs, letters, and documents. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sifted through the papers, almost afraid of what she might find that could change everything. Her attention was caught by an old letter in an envelope with yellowed edges. Written on it were the words, "For Sarah. Read when you're ready." It was a letter from her mother. Sarah slowly tore open the envelope, her fingers trembling. Inside were several pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. "Dear Sarah, if you're reading this letter, then it's time for you to know the truth. I should have told you long ago, but I could never summon the courage. When I was younger, I worked at the Bennett family mansion. There, I met a man I loved more than life itself, Richard Bennett. But his family would never accept someone like me. They threatened me, forcing me to leave. When I discovered I was expecting you, I decided to raise you alone. I didn't want you to be touched by the harshness and coldness of that family. Sarah, I hope you can understand and forgive me for keeping this from you. Everything I did was for your sake. You are the most precious thing I have. With love, Mom." Sarah dropped the letter, her breathing quickened. It was true. Everything Richard had said was true. She was his daughter, a part of the family her mother had so desperately tried to shield her from. The next day, Sarah returned to the mansion. She found Richard in the library, leafing through old albums. His expression softened when he saw her, but there was worry in his eyes. "Did you find anything?" he asked. Sarah nodded and handed him the letter. Richard took it and began reading. His face changed with each line: shock, pain, regret. When he finished, he sank into a chair, burying his head in his hands. "She suffered all this time alone," he whispered. "I should have found her. I should have fought for both of you." Sarah didn't know what to say. Seeing his genuine pain, she felt an unexpected wave of sympathy. "That's in the past now," she said quietly. "We can't change it. But we have the chance to understand each other now." Richard lifted his eyes, filled with sincere gratitude. "You're right," he said. "But there's more you need to know. About how far my family went to destroy Helen." They spent the entire evening going through old albums and uncovering evidence of Richard's father's interference in her mother's life. They found Richard's mother's diary, which was filled with venomous entries about Helen. The pages detailed her disdain for Helen, describing her as someone who disgraces our family and must disappear. This wasn't just prejudice, Richard said as he read another page. It was a full-scale campaign. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Her mother had endured hell to protect her. But why had Helen never told her the whole truth? The answer might still lie somewhere in these records. "We need to find everything that remains," Sarah said firmly. "I want to know the whole story." For the next few days, Sarah and Richard continued to dig through the mansion's library archives. They found fragmented records, letters, and photographs, but the full picture still eluded them. However, their persistence was starting to pay off. One night, Sarah stumbled upon a hidden drawer in an old desk. It was locked, but a small key she had found among Richard's mother's belongings fit perfectly. Inside, she found a stack of faded documents and another letter signed by Helen. In it, Helen described how Richard's father had hired a private detective to follow her even after she had left. "He didn't just make her leave," Richard murmured softly as he read the letter. "He stalked her, threatened her. He didn't want her to exist at all." Sarah picked up one of the photographs found in the drawer. It showed Helen standing in front of a small house, holding a baby, her. The background of the photo seemed familiar, but she couldn't immediately recall where the place was. On the back, someone had scratched, "Margaret, thank you for everything." "Who is Margaret?" Sarah asked, showing the inscription to Richard. Richard frowned, thinking carefully. "I don't have the answers, but it looks like this is our next clue," he said. "She might have been a friend of Helen's, someone who helped her when she left." Richard and Sarah made their way to Boston, following a small street that Sarah recognized from the house in the photo. When they arrived at the location, an elderly woman with clear blue eyes answered the door. "Are you Margaret?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her excitement in check. The woman nodded, eyeing them closely. "I don't know you," she said cautiously. "This is about Helen," Richard interjected. "Did you know her?" At the mention of the name, Margaret froze. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said quietly. Inside, they told her everything they knew. Margaret listened, then sighed heavily. "Helen left a box with me," she said. "She said one day her daughter might come looking for her." The woman retrieved a dusty box from the closet. Sarah opened it and found an old necklace with an engraving, with "Love, Richard," as well as Helen's diary. But the most unexpected discovery was at the end of the diary. It was a faded medical record. The entry under "Father of the Child" was shocking. John Bennett. "This is impossible," Richard muttered. "John Bennett, he's my father." Sarah stared at the document in disbelief. This meant that Richard, the man she had believed was her father, was actually her brother. Margaret, noticing their shock, calmly added, "Helen never told me who the father was, but she said she didn't trust the Bennett family. Now I understand why." Richard was in a state of shock. "My father," his voice trembled with rage. "This is disgusting. He ruined my life, he ruined hers. All for the sake of preserving his power." Sarah felt her world crumbling beneath her feet. This truth turned everything she thought she knew about her past upside down. "What do we do now?" she whispered, looking at Richard. He clenched his fists, his face showing firm resolve. "We can't let the truth stay hidden." After the shocking discovery, Sarah and Richard returned to the mansion, unable to shake the weight of what they had learned. The truth about John Bennett had struck a blow that not only changed their understanding of the past, but also raised questions about what to do next. "We have to do something," Richard said, sitting in the library. "My father has ruined too many lives, including your mother's. This cannot go unpunished." Sarah pondered the situation, unable to shake the feeling that not all the secrets had been uncovered. "You mentioned that your father destroyed all evidence of his interference, but are you sure there's nothing left?" she asked. Richard frowned. "When I was young, my father had a safe in his office. I always wondered what he kept in it." He looked at Sarah. If it's still there, this might be our chance. That very night, Sarah and Richard went to John Bennett's office. The key to the safe was missing, but Richard easily opened it with an old crowbar. Inside, there were documents, some of which had been destroyed or damaged, but a few remained intact. "Here it is," Richard said, pulling out a thick folder. "These are the detective reports. My father didn't just spy on Helen. He stopped, reading the first few lines. He threatened people who tried to help her." Sarah took one of the records. It was a list of names with notes next to them. One name was circled, Margaret Hall. "Margaret knew she was being followed," Sarah whispered. "She kept it hidden to protect Mom." Richard continued flipping through the papers. Among the documents, he found a letter addressed to John Bennett. It was from a private lawyer. "Mr. Bennett, as you requested, I have ensured that all records of your family's extramarital affairs have been destroyed. However, one document has been preserved, the will of your late wife, which left a sum of money to the child of Helen Lawson. The will was hidden as you asked, but if it ever comes to light, the consequences could be serious." "A will?" Sarah exclaimed. "Mom never mentioned anything about money." Richard frowned. "If Mom's will exists, it could change everything. It proves she wanted to protect you, despite my father's actions." Sarah and Richard contacted the lawyer who, as it turned out, was still practicing. Under the pretense of clarifying some legal matters, Richard arranged a meeting with him. The lawyer, Mr. Holcomb, turned out to be a dry and cautious man. When they started asking questions, he initially dodged the answers, but when he realized that Richard knew more than he was letting on, he eventually gave in. "Yes, the will exists," Holcomb confessed. "But I am not authorized to release it until I have official court permission. It will be a lengthy process." "We're not afraid of the courts," Richard said firmly. "But if you decide to cooperate, this might be easier for everyone." Holcomb seemed uncertain, but in the end, he agreed to hand over a copy of the will. Later that evening, as they examined the document, Sarah noticed an unusual detail. The will mentioned another heir, someone she had never heard of. The name sounded familiar, but Sarah couldn't immediately recall where she had heard it. "Who is this?" she asked, showing the name to Richard. He turned pale. "That's my half-brother. My father hid his existence his entire life." Sarah stared at him, feeling her world flip once more. "He could be the key to everything," she said. "If we find him, he might be able to tell us what's still hidden." Sarah and Richard wasted no time. They managed to uncover that Richard's half-brother, mentioned in the will, was named Jonathan Harding. After several hours of searching through archives, social media, and public records, they tracked him down. He lived in a quiet suburb of Boston, far from the luxury and intrigue of the Bennett family. When they arrived at his modest, cozy home, Sarah felt her heart tighten with nervous anticipation. She had no idea how Jonathan would react, or if he was even ready to confront the past he had likely fled long ago. A tall man with graying hair and kind, though tired, eyes answered the door. "How can I help you?" he asked, surveying the strangers with restrained curiosity. "Are you Jonathan Harding?" Richard asked. The man frowned but nodded. "Yes." "And who are you?" "I'm Richard Bennett," Richard replied, noticing how Jonathan tensed at the mention of the surname. "This is my sister, Sarah Lawson. We're here to talk about our father." Jonathan's frown deepened, and he stepped back inside, gesturing for them to follow. "I don't want to know anything about that man," he said sharply. "If you're here to remind me of his generosity or the family he tried to destroy, you're wasting your time." "Wait," Sarah called, stepping forward. "We're not here to justify him. We only recently learned the truth about what he did. But your name is mentioned in his wife's will, and this could be important for all of us." Jonathan froze, and his expression softened. He motioned for them to come inside. Once settled in the cozy living room, Jonathan began to tell his story. "My mother, Catherine Harding, was your father's mistress," he began. "She loved him, but to him, she was just a fling. When she got pregnant, he decided it was best to hide me so that his reputation wouldn't be ruined. He provided for us, gave us a house and money, but we never had a real family. My mother died when I was 15. I was left alone." He met Richard's gaze. "Since then, I've hated the Bennet name." Sarah listened intently, feeling the weight of every word. When Jonathan finished, she spoke. "But you're mentioned in Eleanor's will. This means she knew about you and may have wanted to protect you. She left something not only for me but for you as well." Jonathan looked shocked. "Eleanor Bennet? She knew?" His voice faltered. "I thought she hated all of us." Richard slowly shook his head. "My mother was a complex woman, but she had her principles. If she left something for you, it means she thought it was important." Jonathan agreed to help them. They returned to the mansion, where the three of them continued to examine the documents they had found. Among the papers was another detail, a letter addressed to Eleanor, hinting at a strange deal made by John Bennet. The letter alluded to a secret bank account where money originally meant for Helen might have been kept. But the most unexpected part was that these funds had been transferred into Jonathan Harding's name. "What?" Jonathan jumped up, staring at the letter. "But I never received this money." "Then where is it?" Sarah asked thoughtfully. They decided to check the bank records using Richard's connections. It turned out the funds were indeed in an account, but access had been restricted by John Bennet's instructions. The money remained untouched, despite the fact that it could have changed Helen's life. "This was just another attempt by my father to control everything, even after death," Richard remarked grimly. Sarah looked at Jonathan. "You should claim your rights to this money. It's not just money, it's part of a history he tried to hide." Jonathan silently nodded. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. He had family, perhaps an unusual one, but a real one. That night, the three of them sat in the library, discussing how to proceed. Ahead of them were tough decisions, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt that together they could overcome the ghosts of the past. But as she was heading to bed, Sarah noticed a strange flicker of light in the mirror on the wall. She approached and discovered a hidden compartment behind the frame. When she opened it, an awful sense of foreboding gripped her. Inside was another envelope with the initials J.B. "What did you find?" Richard asked, coming over to her. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the envelope. The letter inside read, "If you're reading this, the truth has finally come to light. But remember, Sarah, my actions were not only for the family, but also for your protection. There are things you still don't know." Sarah stood holding the letter, her fingers trembling. The text was ambiguous, but it carried a sense of threat and hidden secrets. She felt that there was even more behind this note than what they had already uncovered. "For your protection?" Richard frowned, peering over her shoulder. "What does that mean?" Jonathan, who had also stepped closer, studied the letter intently. Perhaps he wasn't just destroying lives. Maybe he was trying to keep something hidden to protect his power. Sarah examined the letter again and again. Finally, she noticed something strange. On the back, there was a faint inscription, barely visible under normal light. "There's something written here," she murmured, holding the letter up to the light. "Northern Tower." Up the stairs, behind the door without a handle. The three of them headed to the northern part of the mansion, an area that had been neglected for years. The stairs creaked under their feet, and the air was filled with the scent of dust and age. Eventually, they found the door without a handle, just as the letter had described. "How do we open it?" Jonathan asked, looking around. Richard inspected the door and found a hidden lever in the wall. When he pulled it, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow room. In the center was a metal chest. Sarah slowly approached and opened the lid. Inside were documents, letters, and several photographs. One of them showed John Bennett with Helen sitting next to him, holding a baby. On the back of the photo was a message: "My only mistake was loving her too much." "This is impossible," Richard whispered. "My father acknowledged his love for Helen?" Sarah frowned as she flipped through the letters. Most were full of emotions she hadn't expected to find. These were letters written by John, begging Helen to return. He confessed his love and regret for his actions. "This changes everything," Jonathan said. "He didn't just destroy her life. He was trying to keep his family together, but in the end, he lost everyone." When they returned to the living room, Sarah held one of the letters. "Now I understand what he was trying to say in his last message," she said. "His protection was about removing anyone who might threaten us from our lives. He wasn't a villain in the conventional sense, but his methods destroyed lives." Richard nodded, staring thoughtfully into the fire. "This doesn't excuse his actions, but I think we need to tell the truth. About his love, his mistakes, and how all of this led us to where we are today." Jonathan sighed. "And what about the money? The will, the accounts, all of that?" he asked. Sarah smiled. "I think we can use it to fix what was broken. We can help others, like Mom, like Margaret." A month later, the Bennett mansion had been transformed into a community center. Sarah, Richard, and Jonathan had invested the money into creating a fund to support single mothers and children. The house, once a symbol of secret pain, became a place where people found help and hope. Sarah, standing at the front entrance, looked at Richard. "We're still family, despite everything, right?" she asked. Richard embraced her. "Yes. Now we're the family we chose." As they stood together, Jonathan joined them, and the three of them felt, for the first time, that their dark past no longer defined their future.